Hey guys, my name is Tensor. Welcome to another Flutter tutorial. In today's tutorial, we'll be talking about localization in Flutter. So what is localization? Well, first, localization is commonly referred to as L10N. This is just a shorthand for localization, and it just stands for the number of letters between L and N on the alphabet. Localization allows you to adapt your application to more markets by doing things like translating the strings into different languages, adding different currency units, adding different units of measurement, adding different dates, addresses, names, phone numbers, etc. So not only does it help you reach more markets, but it also helps your application fit the needs of your users a little bit better. So for instance, if you have a bilingual user that prefers one language, if you support that language, it will help the user like the application more. And as I mentioned before, it's not just language features, it's currency, units of measurement, etc. There's also things like layout options. For instance, some languages you read from right to left rather than left to right, and these are things that all are considerations in localization. There are also some legal ramifications in certain countries. If an application doesn't have a certain specification, it will not be accepted, or you could potentially run into some trouble. So how does localization work in Flutter? Localization is essentially implemented as a widget in Flutter. In fact, it's implemented as an inherited widget, and this means that we can access the localization from any place in our application once we've implemented it. The SDK comes with various different library choices. There are two that we'll be looking at today. The first one is called Intl, and then the second one is called Flutter Localization. Some of these libraries make use of JSON, some of them use ARB, some of them use code generation, and some of them just use simple Dart maps. In our case, we're going to be using ARB and code generation, but it'll look a lot like JSON, and I'll explain it when we get to it. Also, the Locale class and the Localizations widgets are baked directly into the Flutter SDK. These are not just add-ons. These are things that are central to the actual Flutter SDK. Currently, Flutter Localization supports 15 different languages by default. You can, of course, extend this number. It allows you to also change the text direction and orientation of your widgets based on your locale, and you can dynamically change the localization on resume and on reload. This means that, for instance, if your user changes the locale while the application is running, it will automatically update to accommodate. The application that we're going to work with today will be the weather application that we worked with in the past. We'll be using this application because it's a large application and it's a good example. Just for you guys who haven't watched the weather application tutorials, don't worry, you don't need to know much about this application to understand what we're doing. Here's what our built application currently looks like. The basic idea of this application is that we can ping our GPS and then get weather data based on where we are in the world. So the things that we want to change about this application and localize about this application are the title of the application, and that's this weather app piece, and then the text on this button. And we also want to make it so that we can ping our API and get back a specific language. So you can see here it says moderate rain in English. We want this to change to whatever language that we're looking at. So in our case, we're going to implement Spanish and Japanese. And if we're in Japanese, we want this to be Japanese. And if we're in Spanish, we want this to be Spanish. Now, the reason why I'm not going to implement the rest of the strings, like this GPS is active string and the turn on data string, is because it's actually quite easy to continually add this stuff. And just by adding in the two strings, you'll be able to see most of the features of the localizations libraries. To get started, we want to add two things to our pubspec YAML. We want to add Flutter Localizations, and then below it you just write in SDK and then Flutter. And then down here in our dev dependencies, we want to add Intl translation, and the current version of this library is 0.16.6, so that's the version that I will be using. Now, Intl translation will allow us to generate code, and that's why it's in our dev dependencies. the Intl library itself is bundled with Flutter, so we don't have to explicitly add it to our dependencies up here. The first thing that we want to do with our application is create two folders. We want to create an L10N folder. This is where we'll have all of the data files and the generated code files. And then we want to create a folder called Locale, and inside of it we'll create a file called locales.dart. In this file we want to make an import for Flutter material. We need to import the Intl library, and we need Dart asynchronous. We want to create a new class called Applications, and then inside of this class we want to create a static load method. This will be a method that will call to our generated code and then load up the strings that we need based on the locale of the application. So the load method takes in a locale type, and then what we do is we get the actual locale name by running this ternary operator. So we check to see if the country code is empty. If it's empty, then we just put our language code into the name. Otherwise, we just put our locale as a string into the name. Then we want to format the locale by calling Intl canonicalized locale on our name. And this will format it in a specific format. And then we'll call this Initialized message function on our local name, which will give us back a future of app localizations. We can use the then method to run a callback function on it, and this will allow us to return a new app localizations class, as well as set up the Intl default locale property. So we take our locale name and we set it equal to Intl default locale. This tells our application this is the locale that we're currently in, and then we return our app locations object. As I mentioned before, the Initialized messages function is a piece of generated code, so don't worry too much about it right now. We'll go over it after we generate it. Like with an inherited widget, we also want to create a static of method, and this will call to the general localizations class of method. We'll pass in the context and our app localizations, and this will be the method that will allow us to access our app localizations content from anywhere inside of our application in a way that's very similar to an inherited widget. Now we want to create the actual content that we want to translate in our application. So we can create a string which will be our title, and we actually put in the title, and then we can put in some properties like the name and then the description. The name should be the same as the actual variable name because this will be the key that we use to actually associate these values. And we'll do it both for our title and for our button text. And for both of these, we want to call initl.message, put in an actual piece of text that we want to translate, put in the name, and then the description itself is something that's optional. Now we need to set up a custom Localizations Delegate class, and this is the outer wrapper that allows us to access all of the information in our application. So this is all fairly basic. We just override a function called isSupported. We put in the supported language codes. In this case, it's English, Spanish, and Japanese. And we just check to see that the locale that we're passing through contains one of these strings. If it does, then we pass back true, and then we can actually grab the messages that we've created for that locale. If it doesn't, then we pass back false and we just leave it alone. Then we have a load wrapper, which calls to our app locations load method that we created up top. And finally, we have this should reload method, and we're just going to make it so that it passes back false always. And the should reload method just asks whether or not the application should reload everything. And we don't really need that to happen in this case because we're just replacing strings. Alright, so now that we've generated our locales file, we can run a command to actually generate our first ARB file. So we run flutter pub run initl translation extract to ARB, and then for the output dir we want to key in our L10N directory, and then we want to point this towards our locale locales.dart file. So now that that's been executed, you can see here that we actually get a template based on the information that we put into this locales file. So we have a title, and this has an associated title key with it. It has a description, a type, which in this case is text, and then it has placeholders, which are empty in this case because we don't have any placeholders. We also have something for our button text, and again it has an associated key and a description and a type. Now with this initl messages.arb file created, we can create 3 initl files, each one corresponding with a language code that we want to add. So we have Japanese, we have Spanish, and we have English. And then in each of these files, we can add the accompanying strings that we want to add to our application. So for Spanish, for instance, we have our title, which is in Spanish, and then we have the button text, which is in Spanish. And yes, guys, I'm aware that some of you probably speak Spanish. I definitely do not, but I am fluent in Google Translate, and that's where all of these lines are coming from. In most cases, if you do want to localize your app, you'll get a professional translator to fix all of your text for you. In my case, I do not have that luxury. For Japanese, we have some Japanese in here, and I'm actually quite certain that this is very, very wrong Japanese. So again, we have our title, and we have our button text. So with all of these ARB files populated, we can now come back into our terminal and run another command to generate a bunch of Dart files. So this command is flutter pub run initl translation generate from ARB. Our output directory points towards our L10N directory. Then we have a little key that says no use deferred loading. Then we want to point to each of our ARB files. So we have our Spanish file, our English file, and our Japanese file. And we also have our messages file. So this is the initial file that was generated. And then finally, we want to point towards our locales.dart file as well. Now, it's not uncommon to get a warning like this if you do not have a locale specified inside of each of your ARB files. And this is fine because it will get the actual language key directly from the title of the file. Now we've got 5 new Dart files inside of our L10N folder, the most important of which is this messages_all.dart file. Inside of here you can see there's quite a few classes and functions. We've got a map that allows us to map each of our language codes. We've got a switch statement that lets our application choose the correct language code. And then down here we have the Initialized messages function that we talked about before. And this is the function that will actually go in and get all of the strings out and then put them into our application. If we look inside of the other messages files, you can see that the code is a bit different. The most important part is this message lookup class, specifically down here where we have this map. So for button text, we're mapping to a message lookup by library simple text of get the weather. And then for title, we're doing the same thing for weather application. And this continues for the other 2 files as well. So for our Spanish file and our Japanese file. So now to make all of this work properly, we want to get back into our locales.dart file and import the messages.all.dart file into it. And you'll notice that the Initialized messages function will then, of course, fix itself. Now we can come into our main.dart file and make 2 new imports. We want to import our Flutter Localizations, flutterlocalizations.dart package, and we want to import our locales.dart file that we just created. Now down here in the Material App widget, we can fill out 2 new properties. We can fill out the Localization Delegates property, and this takes in a list of Localizations delegates. We created our own custom one, which we put in here, but there are 2 that come with Flutter, the Global Materialization Localizations delegate, and the Global Widgets Localizations delegate. The Material Localizations delegate will replace any text or symbols that are built into the widgets of our Flutter application with the appropriate stuff for the localization. And the Widgets Localizations delegate will change the orientation of the text based on the localization. So if we're using like Arabic, for instance, it will make it so that we're reading the actual text from right to left rather than from left to right. For our supported locales property, we want to put in the locales that we now support. And in this case, we just want to put in the language string. So we're putting in English, Spanish, and Japanese. And then we put in these second empty strings. This is just the country code. And because we don't really care about the country code, we're just going to leave them empty. Now we can generate our title. There are two ways that we could generate the title. I'm going to go with the more idiomatic way, and that is by removing the title property and adding in a property called onGenerateTitle. This allows us to use a builder function to actually build out the title dynamically. So this just takes in the build context, and then it calls app localizations of context.title. So if it's Spanish, it will put out our Spanish title. If it's Japanese, it'll put out our Japanese title. And if it's English, it'll put out our English title. Now that takes care of the title of our application, but we want to change the actual text title that appears on the app bar. So let's come down to our scaffold here and change the text inside of this text widget. All we have to do is remove the text and then type in app localizations of context title, and this will get the title for us. We can also gain access to our locale by calling localizations, locale of, and then just passing in the context. So this is something that you would do inside of the build function, and this can be pretty handy because it allows us to manipulate the locale throughout our application. We will use it so that we can dynamically change the text size of our title, because the Japanese and the Spanish titles are larger than the English title. We'll check to see what our locale is, and if it's English, we want our font size to be 20.0. If it's not English, then we want it to be 15.0. Now let's change the text for our button. So again, all this involves is calling the app localizations of method and then getting the actual string value, which in this case is the button text value. So this will actually make it so that our button and our title will change localization based on the localization of our application. However, it doesn't change the localization of the actual language of the API request. And that's not all that difficult to actually achieve, so let's go do that real quick. On our API URL, we can add a new key called lang, and we can set it equal to a static variable, which will be a string. Then we can create a function that will allow us to set this string. So we just pass in the language code that we want, and this replaces the lang variable with that new code. We'll make it so that the lang variable by default is en for English. And so when we pass in a string into this setLanguage function, it will then concatenate onto the URL request that we're making, which will then send back the response in the preferred language. We can then make a change locale command. And for those of you who didn't watch the weather app tutorials, a command is just a wrapper function that allows us to take a function and turn it into an observable, basically. So we just create a command with create sync1, and our function just takes in a string and it outputs nothing. So we just wrap our repo.setLanguage function and then put it into this command. And then of course we also want to add a change locale command to our constructor. So this args command takes in a string and outputs a null. And then at the bottom we can also put in our change locale command into the factory constructor. So it will actually be proliferated to the rest of our application. Now inside of the build function above our scaffold, we can now call to our model provider with the of method. We can call the change locale command, and then we can call myLocale language code and turn it into a string and pass it into our function. And then right after this, our application automatically calls to get the GPS, and then we go and we fetch our data. We can now reload our weather application, and we should now have localization support for Spanish and Japanese as well as English. So currently we're looking at London in English. If I go to the settings and go down to languages and input, I can click on languages and I can change the English to something else. So let's change it to Spanish first. So I just drag up Spanish and now I go back into our application and you'll see that our title changes and our button changes. And when we fetch the data, the actual weather changes as well. So these names all change into Spanish weather values. Now let's change things into Japanese. So I just slide up Japanese and you can see that the actual title for settings changes. And when I go back into our application, now we have a Japanese title and a Japanese button. And if we go and we request our data, we now have Japanese weather statuses. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you dislike this video, then by all means downvote it as much as you like. Have a good night.